Welcome to the Cozy Storytime, a peaceful place to unwind and relax. Before we begin, be sure to subscribe and like the video to get more soothing stories every night. So, where are you watching this from, and what are you doing right now? I hope you enjoyed this story. Now, take a deep breath, make yourself comfortable, and let's fall asleep peacefully together. This time I will tell you about a Norse mythology story entitled The Forging of the One Ring. In the age before memory fades, when the world was still young and the stars watched in silence, a shadow moved in the depths of Middle-earth. It was not sudden, nor violent, but patient, relentless, a whisper growing into a storm. In the fires of Mount Doom, a power unlike any before was forged. A single ring, golden and perfect, yet bound with something far darker. It was not just metal shaped by flame, but a fragment of will itself, unyielding, consuming, waiting. This is the tale of its making. A story of ambition and betrayal, of the brightest minds led astray, and a darkness that sought to bind the free peoples of Middle-earth beneath its will. Tonight, let the world fade. Let your mind drift into the echoes of the past. Breathe slowly, sink into the depths of time, and listen to the tale of the forging of the One Ring. The land of Mordor stretched vast and desolate under the smothering weight of its eternal gloom. The air was thick with the acrid scent of sulfur, carried on sluggish winds that whispered secrets from the deep chasms of the Black Land. Jagged mountains clawed at the sky, their dark peaks wreathed in mist, forming an unbreakable wall around the domain of the Dark Lord. At the heart of this forsaken realm stood Barad-dûr, the great tower, a monument of malice and dominion, its spires cutting through the endless night like the fangs of some vast and ancient predator. Inside the fortress, in chambers unseen by any living soul, Sauron stood alone. He was no mere king, no simple warlord seeking dominion over men. He was Maya, a being of old, a spirit of power who had once served in the grand order of creation before falling to the whispering promises of his true master, Morgoth. He had been fair once, but that form was long gone. Now, he was darkness embodied, clad in blackened armor that seemed to drink in the feeble light of the torches that flickered weakly upon the stone walls. His eyes burned with an inner fire, their glow piercing even through the shadows that wrapped around him like a cloak. Before him lay a vast anvil, its surface slick with the residue of countless forges, its edges worn by centuries of ceaseless toil. The chamber was deep within the foundations of Barad-dûr, a place where no mortal foot had ever trodden, where the very rock seemed to pulse with an ancient and malevolent force. The forge had been prepared, the tools arranged with meticulous precision. Everything was in place for the grand work that he had long envisioned. Sauron's thoughts drifted across the centuries, recalling the careful steps that had brought him to this moment. It had begun with guile. He had taken a fair form then, adorned in robes of silver and gold, a benevolent and wise presence among the elves of a region. He had whispered to them of secrets long forgotten, of the lost knowledge of all, the Vala who had shaped the mountains and the deep places of the world. He had taught them the craft of forging rings, artifacts of power, vessels to shape the world to their desires. They had welcomed him, named him Anatar, the Lord of Gifts, and with open arms they had embraced his wisdom. How foolish they had been! How blind! The rings of power had been wrought under his careful guidance. The elves, so confident in their wisdom, had labored tirelessly, shaping the gold and silver, weaving enchantments into the metal, believing they were securing their own fate. They had crafted 3 for themselves, rings of unparalleled beauty, imbued with strength and preservation. But they had forged them in secret, beyond his direct influence, and that had angered him. The dwarves had received their share as well, 7 rings that would awaken their hunger for wealth, binding them not to his will, but to their own insatiable greed. And the 9 had been given to men, proud kings and sorcerers, great lords of their time. They had thought themselves immune to corruption. They had been wrong. But despite all his cunning, despite the delicate strings he had woven into each creation, he knew that true mastery had eluded him. The elves had resisted his full control, and the others, while swayed, remained free-willed enough to be unpredictable. That would not do. There could be no room for error, no cracks in the foundation of his dominion. To command the rings of power, he needed a greater ring, a master ring. One that would bind them all to his will, one that would serve as the very keystone of his dominion. And so, he had come here, to the heart of his power, to the heart of the world's greatest forge, the fires of Mount Doom. A slow, deliberate movement brought his hand to the edge of the anvil, his fingers curling over the ancient black stone. The time had come. There could be no hesitation. He stepped away from the forge, his armored boots striking the stone floor with a measured rhythm. As he ascended from the depths of Barad-dûr, he felt the weight of his own power pressing against the world around him. He did not need to see his armies to know that they stood ready. Orcs, trolls, and darker things lurked in the shadows, waiting for his command. But this war would not be fought with brute force alone. No, this was a war of dominion, a war for the very essence of Middle-earth itself. The climb to Mount Doom was neither arduous nor uncertain. It was his domain, his fortress of flame and ruin. The great volcano rumbled in the distance, its molten heart beating in time with the slow, inevitable march of fate. The land trembled as if recognizing its master's approach. The fires within the mountain roared in anticipation, casting eerie shadows that danced upon the jagged cliffs. At the summit, the cracks of doom yawned before him, a great chasm of molten fire, an inferno that had existed since the shaping of the world. It was here that he would forge his greatest creation, here that he would pour his very essence into the metal and bind it to his will. He raised his hand, and the raw gold, the purest and most untouched of all the earth's treasures, was brought forth. The metal gleamed with an otherworldly light, untouched by age or imperfection. It was a fitting vessel, but it was not yet complete. Sauron closed his eyes, and the world seemed to still around him. His presence deepened, expanding beyond the limits of flesh and form. He spoke no words, for words were unnecessary. His will was a force of nature, a command woven into the very fabric of existence. The gold obeyed, bending, twisting, liquefying in the heat of the mountain's heart. Slowly, deliberately, he shaped it, molding it with hands that had built fortresses, that had raised armies, that had crushed nations beneath their weight. Time lost meaning as he worked. The firelight flickered across the chamber, illuminating his form, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch beyond the edges of the world. When at last he held it in his grasp, it was simple in appearance, a plain band of gold, unadorned, unassuming. But he could feel it, pulsing with power, whispering with the echoes of his own will. This was no mere trinket. This was no ordinary ring. This was the one. He lifted it higher, allowing the flames to lick against its surface, and as he did, he breathed into it a final act of creation. His own essence, his own spirit, sank into the metal, fusing with it, binding him to it as surely as it was bound to him. A slow smile crept across his lips as he felt the power settle, as he felt the threads of fate twist and weave around this moment. The world would change. He slid the ring onto his finger, and Middle-earth shuddered. The moment the ring slid onto his finger, Sauron felt a rush unlike anything he had ever known. It was not merely power, it was something deeper, something far more intimate. A binding, a claiming. His very essence had merged with the golden band, the molten core of his being now forever entwined with the metal. The world around him seemed to shift, the edges of reality stretching and bending as his will expanded outward, reaching across Middle-earth like unseen tendrils. The cracks of doom flared brighter for a brief instant, the fire reacting to the birth of something entirely new, something beyond what had ever existed in the physical realm. A quiet hum filled the air, a resonance only he could fully comprehend. This was the pulse of dominion, the rhythm of control, the beat of his newly woven tether to the reins of power. He closed his eyes and let the sensation wash over him. And then he reached out. His mind drifted across the vast lands beyond Mordor, moving as an unseen shadow, searching. The Nine, his chosen, his instruments, were not yet fully bound to him, but he could sense them, distantly. Their rings, though powerful, were incomplete without his guiding hand. Their souls would bend in time, their wills would crumble, and they would become what he had designed them to be. The 7 rings of the dwarves pulsed faintly, but their bearers were stubborn, their hearts locked in stone and greed. He expected resistance from them, but greed was a patient poison. And then, the 3. The moment his awareness brushed against them, he felt it, a sudden resistance, like a door slamming shut before him. The elven rings recoiled, their power severing itself from his reach before he could fully grasp hold. He frowned, eyes snapping open. This was unexpected. His influence should have touched them all, but something had shielded them, something woven with ancient wisdom and foresight. The elves had sensed him. The realization settled over him like cooling iron. They had known. They had suspected. Perhaps they had not fully understood his plan, but they had been wary enough to craft their own safeguard. He did not yet control them. That, too, was unexpected. Frustration simmered in his chest, but he did not allow it to consume him. Not yet. He had expected some measure of resistance, but this was not failure. No, this was merely a challenge, one he would overcome. Still, he needed to understand the full measure of what had happened. He withdrew his presence, pulling back into himself, and turned his gaze toward the fiery chasm below. The ring, still gleaming on his finger, pulsed faintly in the dim light. The letters had not yet been revealed, but he knew they were there, waiting beneath the surface, hidden in the depths of the gold like secrets whispered in the dark. Sauron turned his palm upward and focused. The words needed to be awakened. The flame of Mount Doom, obedient to his call, rose in response. It surged in height, swirling with renewed intensity, tendrils of heat licking at the air around him but never touching his form. He raised his hand, fingers splayed, letting the fire embrace the ring, letting its heat awaken what had been forged within. Slowly, the golden surface changed, dark runes blooming across the metal like cracks in the skin of reality itself. They glowed with an eerie, smoldering light, ancient words in the black speech, written in a tongue only he truly understood. Ashnaz Derbachaluk, Ashnaz Jimbatal. Ashnaz Thracatchaluk Ak Burzamishi Krimpatal. One ring to rule them all, one ring to find them. one ring to bring them all, and in the darkness bind them. Sauron stared at the inscription as the words pulsed with life, as if the ring itself now breathed with his will. It was beautiful in its simplicity, elegant in its purpose. This was more than just a weapon. It was an extension of himself, a piece of his very being given shape. Through it, he would weave his dominion, not by brute conquest alone, but by inevitable, inescapable subjugation. The elves had slipped from his grasp for now, but that would not last forever. He knew their arrogance. They would believe they had won, that they had outmaneuvered him. But their time would come. They were long-lived, but they were not eternal. He was. And he could wait. A low rumble echoed through the chamber, and Sauron turned his gaze from the ring to the world outside. The fires of the mountain still roared, but beyond its slopes, the vast plains of Gorgoroth stretched into shadow. Barad-dûr loomed in the distance, its foundations rooted deep in the blackened earth. This was his kingdom, but it was still incomplete. Mordor was strong, but Middle-earth remained untamed. There were lands yet unconquered, rulers yet unbowed. That would change. The first to fall would be those already ensnared, the men who had taken his gifts without question. They were powerful in their own right, wise by the measure of their kind, but they did not yet understand what their acceptance had truly meant. He would call to them in time, whisper in their dreams, let the weight of their rings press against their souls like a tightening noose. And when they realized they could not resist, when their mortal fears and ambitions had consumed them fully, they would surrender. The Nazgul would rise. He would ensure it. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of ash and embers, the ever-present reminder of what this land was and what it would become. Sauron let the sensation settle over him. He had taken his first step, had crafted the instrument of his will. Now, there was only the matter of wielding it. The world would resist, as it always did, but resistance was futile in the face of inevitability. He turned from the chasm, descending the path from the mountaintop with measured strides. The ring remained on his finger, its weight a reassuring presence. The first move had been made. Soon, the next would follow. There was still much to be done. The night over Mordor was thick with smoke, the stars all but swallowed by the endless black that coiled above the land like a living thing. From the summit of Mount Doom, the glow of fire painted the sky with a deep, sullen red, the very air trembling beneath the force of its fury. Sauron descended the ashen slopes, his blackened armor gleaming faintly beneath the molten light. The ring upon his finger, though newly forged, already pulsed in rhythm with his essence. He could feel it, a quiet presence humming in his mind, amplifying his thoughts, sharpening his will. Each step he took sent tremors through the earth, the weight of his presence pressing upon the land itself. This was his domain, shaped by his hand, bound to his purpose. And yet, even as he moved with the certainty of conquest, a flicker of frustration burned within him. The elves had felt him. They had sensed his hand reaching for them and recoiled before the binding could take hold. That they had anticipated his designs so quickly was troubling, but not unexpected. He had underestimated their foresight. That would not happen again. A gust of wind carried the scent of charred rock and molten metal through the air, whipping at the heavy cloak that billowed behind him. As he neared the base of the volcano, the jagged silhouette of Barad-dûr loomed in the distance, its spires stabbing into the sky like the broken ribs of a dead god. Even from here, he could feel the ceaseless movement within its walls, the labor of orcs toiling in its forges, the restless stirrings of creatures lurking in its depths. It was a place of order, of relentless industry, a machine that would grind the world beneath its gears. The fortress gates opened at his approach, the great slabs of blackened iron groaning as they swung wide. Inside, the vast halls stretched before him, lined with banners bearing the sigil of the lidless eye, its gaze unblinking in the dim torchlight. Lesser beings scattered from his path, orc captains bowing low, trolls lumbering aside with guttural murmurs of submission. He paid them no mind. There were only a few in his service who were worth his attention, and it was they he had summoned. Deep within the tower, in a chamber of stone and shadow, they awaited him. The air here was thick with the scent of burning incense, mingling with the ever-present stench of blood and iron. At the room's center stood a great circular table of dark obsidian, its surface marred by carvings of twisted forms, ancient sigils that spoke of power and ruin. Seated around it were his chosen. At the head was the mouth of Sauron, his chief lieutenant, a man once of Númenorian blood, now twisted and hollowed by years of servitude. His face was obscured by the mask he always wore, his lips curled in a perpetual sneer. Across from him, cloaked figures lingered in the shadows, their presence subdued, their voices whispers in the dark. These were the envoys of the Nine, the kings of men who had taken his rings without question, still clinging to their last shreds of autonomy. For now, Sauron took his place at the head of the table, his armored fingers tapping against the stone with measured precision. Silence hung over the room, heavy and expectant. "The forging is complete," he said, his voice a deep, rolling thunder that sent shivers through those gathered. "The one ring is mine, and through it, the power of the others shall bend." The mouth of Sauron inclined his head. And yet, the elves resist. A flicker of irritation passed through Sauron's gaze, but he did not let it show. They anticipated treachery, but their delay will not last. The three are powerful, yes, but they are disconnected from me. They will not wield them freely, for they fear what they now suspect. He leaned forward, his burning eyes sweeping across the gathered figures. "That fear is a weakness, and I shall exploit it." One of the shadowed figures shifted uneasily. "What would you have of us, my lord?" Sauron's fingers curled into a fist. The chamber darkened slightly, the torches flickering as his will pressed outward. "The Nine shall learn to listen. They are still men, still bound by their own ambitions, but their fate is sealed. Their rings will lead them to me in time, but we must hasten the process." He let his gaze settle upon each of them, his voice lowering to a near whisper. "Go to them. Speak to them. Let their fears fester. Let them dream of power beyond their grasp. The more they indulge, the more they will fade, until nothing remains but obedience." The figures murmured in assent, shadows shifting as they moved to carry out his will. The mouth of Sauron, however, remained still. His head tilted slightly, the air between them thick with unspoken understanding. "And the elves?" the lieutenant asked. Sauron exhaled slowly, a sound more like the grind of stone than breath. "The elves will come to know their mistake in time. They believe they can stand apart, that they can wield their rings without consequence. But they will learn that there is no freedom in defying me." His voice deepened, reverberating through the walls. "Already, the world turns in my favor. The kingdoms of men grow restless. The dwarfs cling to their hoarded wealth, blind to the chains that tighten around them. and Mordor rises. He stood then, his presence towering over the gathered. The flames in the chamber flared higher, as if mirroring the dark purpose that swelled within him. The war does not begin with swords. It begins with whispers. It begins with doubt. He lifted his hand, the one ring catching the firelight, its inscription smoldering faintly beneath the surface. He could feel it working already, stretching across the lands, calling to those bound by the lesser rings, planting seeds of submission. "This is the first step," he murmured, more to himself than to those present. Outside the tower, the wind howled, carrying the first echoes of what was to come. The dreams came first. They were subtle at first, creeping into the minds of the 9 kings like whispers carried on the wind. In the darkness of their chambers, in the silence of their halls, the voices called to them. They spoke of power, of dominion, of endless life. They painted visions of golden cities rising beneath their rule, of enemies brought low before their feet, of an existence unfettered by time. And the kings listened. In their waking hours, they dismissed the dreams as fleeting fantasies, the product of restless minds weighed by the burdens of rule. But as the nights passed, the dreams grew more vivid, more insistent. The whispers turned to commands, and the kings, once proud and strong, began to waver. The rings upon their fingers no longer felt like gifts but chains, tightening with each passing day. Sauron watched from afar, his presence woven into the fabric of their thoughts. He did not need to force their descent. They were already falling, drawn into the web he had so carefully spun. Each of them had taken his gifts willingly, believing themselves masters of their own fate. But the truth was far crueler. They had never been masters. The process was slow, deliberate. The rings did not strip them of their will all at once. That would have been too crude, too simple. Instead, they eroded them, piece by piece, until resistance became unthinkable. Their ambitions became obsessions. Their fears turned to paranoia. The world around them dimmed until only the voice of their unseen master remained. And then, the changes began. The first to fall was Camul, the Easterling king. His court had grown uneasy in recent months, troubled by his increasingly erratic behavior. He spoke often of unseen threats, of hidden enemies conspiring against him. He trusted no one, not even his own sons, and in the end, it was his own madness that drove him from his throne. He vanished one night, leaving behind a palace draped in silence. His people searched for him, but he was nowhere to be found. Some claimed he had fled into the mountains. Others whispered that he had been swallowed by the shadows. They were not wrong. The others followed soon after. One by one, the kings abandoned their thrones, disappearing into the growing darkness. Some left willingly, unable to resist the pull of the rings. Others fought against it, clinging to their last shreds of defiance until there was nothing left to fight. And in the black halls of Barad-dûr, Sauron waited. When the first of them arrived at his gates, he did not greet them with force or fury. He did not need to. They had already surrendered. Camul knelt before him, his face pale, his eyes hollow. The once mighty king no longer spoke of enemies. He no longer spoke at all. When Sauron looked upon him, he saw not a man, but a shadow or wraith, caught between worlds, bound to his will. The others followed soon after, their transformation inevitable. Their bodies became insubstantial, their presence fading from the world of the living. They no longer needed mortal forms. The rings had stripped them of such limitations. What remained were shades of what they once were, bound forever to the will of the one who had forged their fate. The Nine had fallen. The Nazgul had risen. Sauron stood upon the blackened balcony of Barad-dûr, gazing across the barren lands of Mordor. Below him, his wraiths stood in formation, silent, awaiting his command. Their presence was a testament to his triumph, a symbol of what was to come. The world had not yet realized it, but the war had already begun. Sauron stood atop the highest balcony of Barad-dûr, gazing across the smoldering expanse of Mordor. The black sky churned above him, thick with the smoke of his forges, the air heavy with the stench of fire and steel. Below, the great armies of his dominion stirred, vast legions of orcs, trolls, and creatures twisted by his will. His power was growing, spreading like an unstoppable tide, yet the world beyond Mordor had not yet fully bowed to him. Not yet. But it would. Behind him, the Nine stood motionless. They no longer resembled the kings they had once been. Their forms were shrouded in darkness, their bodies barely visible beneath the black cloaks that swayed in the wind. Their eyes, if they still possessed them, were hidden beneath their hoods, but Sauron did not need to see them to know the truth. They belonged to him now, their wills bound to his, their existence reduced to mere extensions of his purpose. The transformation had been exquisite. They did not speak unless commanded, nor did they question their fate. There was no need. The power of the Nine Rings had consumed them, their mortal fears and ambitions hollowed out and replaced with an unrelenting, singular devotion. They were his perfect servants, his heralds of terror. And soon they would be tested. Sauron turned from the view, his heavy footsteps echoing as he descended into the inner sanctum of his fortress. The great throne chamber awaited him, its vast pillars stretching toward the vaulted ceiling, the air thick with the hum of unseen forces. At its center, a stone pedestal stood, upon which rested a darkened orb, the Palantir. A gift of the Vala in another age, twisted now to serve his will. He approached it slowly, his gauntlet fingers brushing against the cold surface. The connection flared instantly, and the world beyond Mordor unfolded before his gaze. Gondor, Arnor, Rivendell, Lorien. The lands of men and elves still stood defiant, their rulers yet unaware of the storm that gathered beyond their borders. The elves had grown suspicious, their hands clutching their rings but refusing to wield them openly. Gil-galad, the High King of the Noldor, had begun to fortify his realm, his wisdom warning him of the unseen hand that moved against Middle-earth. But it was the men who interested Sauron most. They were fragile, uncertain. The great Númenórean kingdom had not yet moved against him, but their presence loomed over the world, their influence stretching across the lands of Middle-earth like a long shadow. They were powerful, but power alone was not enough. Even the mightiest of kings could be brought to ruin if their foundations were weakened, their hearts led astray. Sauron pressed deeper into the vision, his gaze sweeping across the lands of the south and east. There, his influence had already taken root. The Haradrim marched beneath his banners, their leaders swayed by promises of wealth and dominion. The Easterlings, too, had begun their march, their loyalty forged in blood and conquest. The world was shifting, the balance tilting ever so slightly in his favor. But it was not yet enough. His enemies still held fast, their unity unbroken. That had to change. A flicker of movement caught his eye, and the vision shifted. Deep within the forests of a region, the forges of the elves still burned, their smiths crafting wonders beyond mortal comprehension. Celebrimber, their greatest craftsman, had not yet fallen, though the trap had already been set. Sauron had played his role well, weaving his lies with the patience of a master artisan. He had walked among the elves as Anatar, the Lord of Gifts, offering them knowledge, guiding their hands in the crafting of the rings of power. He had given them everything they needed, and in their arrogance, they had accepted it without question. But now, they resisted. They had sensed the darkness behind his gifts too late, but not late enough for his plan to unfold as intended. The three rings, Vilya, Ninya, and Narya, had slipped from his grasp, their power hidden from him. That was a miscalculation, one that needed to be corrected. The time for patience was ending. Sauron withdrew from the palantir, his gaze hardening as he turned toward the waiting Nazgul. They did not move, did not breathe, merely awaited his will. "It is time," he said, his voice a quiet thunder. "Go forth. Seek the bearers of the rings. Hunt them. We shall see how long their defiance lasts." The nine moved as one, their cloaks shifting like liquid shadow as they turned and departed. They did not need horses, not yet, but when they rode, the world would tremble beneath their hooves. Sauron exhaled slowly, his fingers tightening around the edge of the pedestal. The game had begun. The wind carried the scent of fire and death. A region burned. Once, it had been a land of beauty, its forests rich with golden leaves, its rivers clear as polished gems. Here, the elves had crafted wonders unmatched by any other race, their forges alive with the ringing of hammers upon enchanted steel. It was here that the rings of power had been made, each one a testament to the skill and ambition of the Noldor. But now, those same forges lay in ruin, their flames drowned in blood and ash. Sauron stood amidst the devastation, his armor gleaming black beneath the glow of the fires. His armies swarmed through the streets of Ostinedhil, the once great city of the elven smiths, now little more than a tomb for those who had dared to defy him. Orcs flooded through the shattered gates, their guttural war cries echoing against the crumbling walls. The resistance had been fierce. The elves of a region were not weak, nor were they ignorant of war. They had held the city for weeks against his relentless siege, their warriors fighting with a desperation that only those facing certain doom could muster. They had fought for their homes, for their kin, for the rings that had once been their pride. But they had lost. The hosts of Mordor had been too many, their fury too great. The gates of Ostinedhil had fallen beneath the onslaught of siege engines, its towers reduced to rubble under the unrelenting barrage. And now, the streets ran red with the blood of elves. Sauron stepped over the broken body of a warrior, his silver armor still shining despite the filth and gore that covered it. A fine blade lay beside him, its edge now dulled, its master's hand forever stilled. He barely spared it a glance. There was only one prize here that mattered. Celebrimber, the greatest of the elven smiths, the last true obstacle in Sauron's conquest of the rings. It was he who had forged the three, he who had hidden them from his sight. Sauron could feel them even now, distant and shrouded, their power resisting his call. He could not touch them, not yet. But their maker was his. The screams had faded by the time Sauron reached the heart of the ruined city, the grand halls where the greatest works of the Noldor had been wrought. The once proud banners of a region had been torn from their places, the sigil of the House of Fëanor trampled beneath the boots of orcs. Fires raged unchecked, their embers spiraling into the night sky like dying stars. And there, bound in chains of blackened iron, was Celebrimbor. The elf lord had been beaten, his once pristine robes torn and bloodied, his silver hair matted with sweat and dirt. Yet his eyes, sharp and defiant, still burned with the remnants of his unbroken spirit. Even now, surrounded by death and ruin, he did not beg. Sauron stepped closer, his massive frame casting a shadow over the kneeling elf. The heat of the surrounding fires reflected in his black armor, his crimson gaze piercing through the smoke. "You have lost," Sauron said, his voice low, measured. "Your city is ash. Your people are dead. And soon, your works will belong to me." Celebrimbor did not answer. His breath was ragged, but his silence spoke louder than words. Sauron studied him for a moment before continuing. "Where are the three?" Nothing. He had expected as much. The elf would not break easily. But that did not matter. The time for words was ending. With a flick of his hand, Sauron motioned to the waiting orcs. They obeyed without hesitation, dragging Celebrimbor to his feet and forcing him toward the ruined forge. The fires had been rekindled, their heat searing the air, the very walls shimmering from the intensity. "You will tell me," Sauron said, his tone as impassive as the iron he commanded. And so, the torture began. It lasted for days. Sauron was patient. He did not rush, did not allow his temper to rule him. Pain was an art, and he was its master. He broke Celebrimbor piece by piece, stripping away flesh, shattering bone, letting the agony draw forth the secrets he desired. But the elf did not break. Even as the agony became unbearable, even as his body withered beneath the torment, Celebrimbor refused to yield. He did not scream, did not beg. He endured, his spirit unbending even as his body failed him. Sauron admired his resolve. And yet, in the end, it changed nothing. Celebrimbor would not betray the three, but the other rings, those of men and dwarves, were already his. The vaults of a region had been plundered, their treasures taken as spoils of war. The 7 and the 9 now belonged to him, and through them he would shape the fate of Middle-earth. When at last Sauron grew tired of the game, he ended it. Celebrimbor's broken body was nailed to the gates of Ostinidhil, his lifeless eyes staring into the distance as if still defying the darkness that had claimed his home. A message for any who still thought to challenge him. The war was not yet over, but its course had been decided. Middle-earth would kneel. The fall of a region had sent a tremor through Middle-earth. Far and wide, the news traveled, carried by wind, by whispers, by the echoes of the dying. The realm of the elven smiths was no more, its people scattered, its wonders plundered, its greatest craftsmen butchered and hung like carrion for all to see. Where once the forges of Ostinidhil had blazed with light and creation, now only ruin remained. And yet, the war was not won. Not yet. Sauron stood upon the highest tower of Barad-dûr, his gaze sweeping across the dark lands of Mordor. Below him, the forges churned endlessly, their fires fed by ceaseless labor, the clang of hammer upon metal never faltering. The hosts of Mordor swelled with each passing day, orcs pouring from the deep pits beneath his fortress, their numbers now beyond count. The rings were his. Not all, but enough. The 9 had already fallen completely into his grasp, bound to his will by the power of the One Ring. They moved in shadows, no longer men but wraiths, their bodies forsaking the world of the living. Through them, Sauron's reach extended far beyond Mordor, his influence whispering into the corners of distant lands. The kings who had once wielded them were no more, only the Nazgul remained. The 7 had also been taken, though they did not bend as easily. The dwarves were stubborn, their hearts too resistant to corruption. Greedy, yes. Ambitious, certainly. But they did not fall into shadow as men did. Their kind had been shaped by Allah's hand, and they did not yield to Sauron's dominion as readily as he had hoped. But they were not immune. The rings did not make them wraiths, but they filled their hearts with insatiable desire. They drove them deeper into their minds, further into the dark, until their greed became their undoing. They hoarded wealth beyond reason, dug too deep, awoke things that should have been left undisturbed. It did not matter. In the end, the rings would break them in ways they did not yet understand. But the 3... Sauron's fist clenched. The 3 eluded him still. Their power had been hidden from his sight, their bearers wise enough to shield themselves from his influence. But Sauron was not blind. He knew where they had gone. One was in Rivendell, in the hands of Gil-galad, the High King of the Elves. Another had passed to Galadriel, deep within the heart of Lorien. The third was hidden away, protected, yet Sauron's reach would find it in time. They could not hide forever. The war had not ended with the region. It had only just begun. The elves had fled, some to the havens in the west, others to Rivendell, where Elrond had gathered what remained of their forces. They were fractured, their numbers depleted, yet they were not broken. Sauron knew the elves too well, knew their stubborn pride, their refusal to fade quietly into the dark. They would fight, even in the face of hopelessness. He would give them no quarter. The time had come to march upon Rivendell, to crush the last remnants of resistance before they could rebuild. His armies were ready, countless legions of orcs, trolls, and wargs thirsting for slaughter. The Nazgul would lead them, their presence enough to send even the bravest warriors into despair. But Sauron did not rush. There was something else that demanded his attention first. In the depths of Barad-dûr, in the heart of his great fortress, the One Ring called to him. He descended through the darkened corridors, his steps slow, deliberate. The air grew thick with heat as he passed into the chamber where the Forge of the Ring had been built, where the fires of Mount Doom had shaped his greatest creation. The very walls pulsed with power, the remnants of the forging still lingering in the air. Upon a black stone pedestal, the ring awaited him. It was simple in form, unadorned, a band of pure gold that gleamed in the dim light. Yet within it lay the essence of his very being, a fragment of himself bound to an artifact of immeasurable power. He had poured everything into its making, his will, his malice, his endless hunger for dominion. He reached out, his fingers closing around the ring. Power surged through him, a tide of strength unlike anything else in Middle-earth. The world sharpened, his vision expanding beyond the walls of Barad-dûr, beyond the mountains of Mordor. He could see the land stretching before him, feel the tremors of war upon the earth. The great rulers of the West, the scattered remnants of resistance, none of them could hide from his gaze. Through the ring, he could hear the whispers of the 9, their thoughts bound to him. He could feel the weight of the 7, the greed they ignited in the hearts of dwarves. And beyond all that, faint and distant, he could sense the three, elusive, hidden, but not beyond his reach. Not forever. Sauron turned the ring in his fingers, watching as the inscription upon it flared to life, glowing with an eerie golden light. One ring to rule them all, one ring to find them. One ring to bring them all and in the darkness bind them. The words burned against the gold, a promise of what was to come. The time for waiting had ended. The world would burn. The sky above Mordor boiled with black clouds, rolling like a storm that would never break. From the highest tower of Barad-dûr, Sauron stood, his gaze fixed beyond the shadowed mountains of his domain. The war had begun in earnest. His armies, vast and endless, marched upon the lands of elves and men. The strength of Mordor was unleashed, and none could stand before it. But the enemy had not yet fallen. The elves, fractured though they were, still clung to their ancient lands. Rivendell remained a sanctuary, its borders protected by spells older than the race of men. Lorien endured, shrouded in a timeless power that even the ring could not yet pierce. And then there was Númenor, the great kingdom of men across the sea, a power that even Sauron had not yet fully reckoned with. Still, he knew the truth. Their resistance was fleeting. The tide of darkness was unstoppable, and soon, all of Middle-earth would bow. Sauron turned his attention to the ring in his grasp. Its surface gleamed in the dim firelight, the inscription upon it fading now, lying dormant but never forgotten. With it, his dominion was absolute. Through it, his will extended beyond his own flesh, into the very hearts of those who had dared to challenge him. And yet, the three still eluded him. Their power remained beyond his reach, wielded by Gil-galad, Galadriel, and Círdan. He could feel them, distant and veiled, resisting the call of the One. It was an irritation, a flaw in an otherwise perfect victory. That flaw would be corrected in time. But for now, there was war to finish. Underscore 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 underscore. The armies of Mordor surged across Middle-earth like a black tide, crushing all in their path. Orcs, trolls, and fell beasts poured from the gates of Barad-dûr, their ranks endless. The world burned in their wake. Sauron himself took to the field, clad in black armor that swallowed the light, the one ring shining upon his finger. Where he walked, hope withered. Where he struck, none could stand. He swept through the battlefield like a storm given form, his great mace-shattering shield and bow alike. The men of Middle-earth fell before him, their might undone by the power of the ring. Cities burned, fortresses crumbled, and those who had once called themselves kings knelt before his dominion. But there was one last challenge. The elves and men had united, their final stand gathered upon the slopes of Mount Doom. Gil-galad, High King of the Noldor, stood alongside Elendil of Númenor, their armies forming a desperate line against the advancing shadow. The last alliance. Sauron watched them from the distance, his expression unreadable beneath his helm. They had come to die. They had come to resist the inevitable. So be it. The battle raged for days. Elves and men fought side by side, their banners flying beneath a sky darkened by the fumes of Mount Doom. The ground was soaked in blood, the air thick with the stench of death. Sauron's armies clashed against them, wave after wave, breaking upon the shields of the last alliance. But the tide of darkness was endless. One by one, their defenses crumbled. The elves, mighty though they were, could not match the sheer numbers of Mordor. The men, for all their valor, fell like wheat before the scythe. And at last, Sauron himself strode onto the battlefield. With the one ring upon his finger, he was a force beyond reckoning. His blows sent warriors flying, his very presence striking terror into the hearts of his enemies. Gil-galad stood before him, defiant and unyielding. Their battles shook the earth, the clash of blade against armor echoing across the plains. But even the High King of the Elves was no match for the Dark Lord. Gil-galad fell, his body burned by Sauron's wrath. Elendil rushed to take his place, grief and fury guiding his blade. He struck with all the might of Numenor, his sword Narsil flashing in the dim light. But Sauron was stronger, his power too great. He shattered Elendil with a single strike, the king's body crumpling to the ground beside his fallen ally. Victory was at hand. But fate is cruel, even to the mighty. As Sauron loomed over the fallen, Isildur, son of Elendil, grasped his father's broken sword. With one last desperate stroke, he brought the shattered blade down upon Sauron's hand. The one ring was severed. A scream tore through the battlefield, a sound that shook the heavens and sent waves of darkness rippling across the land. Sauron's form convulsed, his body unraveling, his power torn from him in an instant. He reached for the ring, but it was gone, tumbling from his grasp, slipping beyond his reach. Without it, he was undone. His body collapsed, his great armor clattering to the ground, empty, lifeless. The shadow that had threatened to consume Middle-earth was vanquished. For now, underscore 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 underscore. Sauron was not dead. The One Ring held his essence, his will, his very soul. As long as it endured, so too did he. Though his body was lost, though his empire crumbled, he was not truly defeated. He had fallen into shadow. But shadows do not die. They wait. And one day, the ring would be found again. And with it, Sauron would rise. Middle-earth had won its reprieve. But its doom was only delayed. And so, the wheel of fate continues to turn. The ring has been forged, destiny has been written, and the darkness moves in silence. Yet, even as power seeks to reign and shadows stretch far and wide, there will always be those who refuse to bow. There will always be a light that endures, however faint, however fragile. But time never stops. The journey is not yet over. The ring, though hidden, still pulses with life, waiting, calling. For the power bound within it cannot die, it only sleeps. But for tonight, let this tale rest. Let your mind drift gently, like a leaf floating upon the surface of a quiet lake. Let the world of Middle-earth fade into silence, slowly disappearing, wrapped in peace. And as your eyes grow heavy, let the whispers of time carry you into a deep and restful sleep, until we meet again, in a story yet to be told.